Hi everyone. Today we are unpacking a big question. How has carbon pricing grown worldwide from 2015 to 2025 in the last 10 years? Carbon pricing, which includes carbon taxes and cap and trade, which is also known as emission trading system ETS, is one of the most powerful tools government use to fight climate change. It puts a monetary cost on carbon dioxide emissions, incentivizing companies and consumers to pollute less. But how widely has it spread, and how high are those prices? Stick around to the end to find out. And don't forget to comment below if you think carbon pricing works. Now, here are a few quick definitions. Carbon tax. Now, what is a carbon tax? Carbon tax is a direct fee on each ton of carbon dioxide. Think of it like a fuel tax. Emitters pay a fixed price per ton. Emission trading system, ETS, often called cap and trade, sets a cap on total emissions and lets companies buy or sell permits. The market then determines the carbon price. Simply put, with an ETS, you trade permits. With a carbon tax, you pay a set rate. Both put a price signal on carbon, but both of them work very differently. Carbon pricing is spreading fast. In 2015, only about 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions were covered by any carbon price, with roughly 8% under ETS and 4% under taxes. By 2023, it had jumped to around 23 to 24%, and the latest data show that about 28% of emissions now face a carbon price. In other words, nearly 1 in 3 tons of carbon dioxide emitted in 2025 is subject to a carbon price. Alongside coverage, carbon pricing instruments have multiplied. In 2012, there were only 20 national subnational schemes. By mid-2015, this had nearly doubled to 38. You might be surprised to know that today there are over 100 active carbon pricing instruments globally, about 80 compliance systems and 20 plus voluntary credit schemes. Now, these include carbon taxes and ETS programs at national, regional, and even local levels around the world. Now, let me clarify a few things. A carbon tax works like this. The government says emitters must pay X dollar for every ton of carbon dioxide they emit. It's straightforward and stable. You always know the cost per ton. For example, Sweden has a carbon tax of over $150 per ton, making gasoline and heating very expensive and clean energy relatively cheaper. And ETS, which is cap and trade, is like a market for pollution permits. The government sets a cap on emissions and issues allowances, which are permits. If a factory emits less than its allowance, it can sell the spare permits to others. If it emits more, it must buy permits. This creates a market-driven carbon price. In effect, companies trade emission credits until supply meets demand. The classic case, the EU emission trading system started in 2005, which has one of the world's highest carbon prices today. In short, carbon tax is equal to fixed price on carbon. ETS is equal to fixed quantity or a cap with a flexible price. Both count as carbon pricing, but they play out, as I told you earlier, very differently. The World Bank notes that an ETS places a limit on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, establishing a market price for emissions, while a carbon tax directly sets a price on carbon. In practice, many jurisdictions use a mix of both, and some add even offset credits. But taxes and ETS always dominate. Now let's look at the big picture. How many emissions are priced and how much money does that generate? Carbon pricing also raises cash for governments. Revenues hit record highs, about $95 billion in 2022 and roughly $104 billion in 2023. In 2024, these schemes mobilized over $100 billion into public. Often this money is used for clean energy subsidies or general budget. To simply putting a price on carbon is now $100+ billion industry yearly. Now, carbon pricing tends to start with big emitters. Over half of power sector emissions worldwide are now priced, mainly because electricity generators often fall under an ETS or tax-heavy industry, such as steel and cement, is partially covered. But sectors like aviation, shipping, agriculture, buildings, and transport remain mostly outside. Now, one needs to expand to these new sectors because that then will be a key step. For example, aviation and shipping are now being discussed in some carbon programs. Coverage is one thing, price levels are another. How much are companies actually paying per ton of carbon dioxide remains a big question. The answer varies wildly by country and system. In 2015, most carbon prices were very low. A World Bank report from the year shows 85% emissions under carbon pricing had prices below $10 per ton. In fact, the price range was roughly $1 to $130, but nearly all covered emissions paid under $10. A take-home in 2015 carbon pricing was mostly a light tap, not a heavy push, I must say. But by 2024, prices have increased in many places, but they still vary. According to a recent survey, global carbon prices ranged from as little as $0.46 to as high as $167 per ton. The average across all systems was only about $32 per ton of carbon dioxide. Now, this was in April 2024. For comparison, economists recommend prices of roughly $50 to $80 ton or higher to meet Paris Agreement. Now let's break it down by region and highlight some key policy milestones that explains the trends what I'm talking about. Let's first take Europe. The EU ETS, which has been there since 2005, is the backbone. Its price soared from €5 to €10 per ton in the year 2010 to around €65 to €80 per ton between 22 to 2024. Beyond the ETS, notable new measures include the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which started a transitional phase in October 2023. CBAM forces importers to report emissions embedded in certain goods, such as iron, steel, cement, etc., effectively extending carbon pricing to imports. The European Green Deal also expanded the EU ETS scope and set up a new separate ETS2 for buildings and transport by 2027 and 2028. In short, Europe has both high carbon prices and expanding policies. Now let's look at China. In 2021, China launched its national plan, initially covering power plants. Now this was a huge step. It covers 88 billion tons CO2, which is about 60% of China's emission, making it the world's largest carbon market by volume. Early allowance prices were modest, which opening to about $7 to $8 per ton, rising to $13. China's ETS builds on regional pilot markets. Over time, China will expand the ETS to industry sectors such as steel, cement in phases. Now, if you look at the policy milestone, January 2024 regulations gave the ETS a legal footing and more sectors were bought in China. Let's look at India. India has been slower but is gearing up. In 2024, India adopted the CCTS, which is Carbon Credit Trading Scheme, a rate-based ETS covering 9 energy-intensive industries. Now, this is a major new policy for India. India's central government gave legal backing. This was via Energy Conservation Act amendment to launch a carbon market. The CCTS focuses on emission intensity, not absolute caps. The idea is that sectors outperforming an efficiency benchmark earn tradable credits. Now, details are still rolling out for CCTS, but it marks India's first national carbon market scheme. Now, the milestone is in July 2024, adoption of the CCTS. Now, let's look at North America. Canada has a federal carbon tax, which is roughly around $65 per ton by 2030, and several provinces run ETS, for example, Quebec. In the US, there's no federal carbon price, but states and regions lead. For example, California Quebec ETS, which started in 2013, and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in Northeast states. New local initiatives are emerging. For example, the US federal government hasn't yet approved one, but several bills have been proposed, and some US cities are exploring carbon pricing. In Mexico, there is a small carbon tax of $3 per ton on fossil fuels. Other emerging markets are also gearing up. In 2023-2024, many new programs were launched in emerging markets. For example, Indonesia launched a carbon tax and is developing an ETS for power. Austria and Indonesia both implemented new instruments. South Korea's ETS has been there since 2015 and it covers power and industry. Countries like Chile and Colombia have carbon taxes. Notably, Australia planned to introduce a new ETS in 2023, but that was cancelled under a new government. Many developing economies like Brazil, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia are also planning or debating carbon markets. Overall, the regional picture is that Europe and parts of Asia, such as China, Korea, lead in carbon price levels and coverage. North America is in the middle, and Latin America, Africa, Middle East lag, but are catching up soon with taxes and discussion. There are several factors which explain why carbon pricing has grown since 2015. The first is Paris Agreement. All major economies made net zero or emission cut commitments, spurring governments to adopt carbon pricing as a credible policy. Taxes and ETS auctions raise money, so governments like having this tool to fund green spending or fill budget gaps. In fact, governments collected over $100 billion per year from carbon pricing. As the science became clearer, more leaders saw carbon pricing as economically efficient. New administrations like in China, Canada, and some EU countries have introduced ambitious carbon pricing schemes. The EU CBAM is pressurizing exporters to think about carbon pricing so they aren't disadvantaged in European market. Investors and companies are increasingly factoring in carbon costs, which creates pressure for governments to formalize those costs in law. So let's look at a big question. Is global carbon pricing at a climate saving level? No, not yet. Most experts say prices and coverage need to be much higher to meet climate goals. A high-level takeaway is that while progress is real, it's insufficient for 1.5 to 2 degree pathways. The High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices say we need $50 to $100 per ton carbon price by 2030 for a 1.5 to 2 degree pathway. Currently, the world average is about $32, and at many places it's much less. Less than 1% of emissions are priced at those high prices. In practice, this means Europe might go even higher, and every other system needs to ramp up. Carbon taxes must rise, and ETS caps must tighten to put prices up. One needs to expand coverage. Currently, we are doing only 28%. Coverage means 72% of emissions still have no carbon price. To drive real change, carbon pricing needs to cover most big emitters. That means extending schemes to new sectors. For example, including transportation fuel, aviation, shipping, buildings, and even agriculture. The EU and some countries are starting this and may consider how to price flight fuel. Emerging economies must also bring carbon pricing to heavy industries. Basically, broader coverage is equal to bigger impact. Raising carbon cost is easier if governments use the revenues wisely. Funding clean energy, helping low-income households, and investing in just transition programs. This makes carbon pricing more politically palatable. Notably, over half of carbon revenue today goes to climate or nature. Border adjustments like CBAM and linking ETS can help prevent leakage and spread carbon pricing. Global agreements like the Article 6 of Paris Pact aims to allow linking carbon markets, so that's just starting. Ultimately, carbon pricing alone isn't magic. It must be a part of a broader strategy. For example, renewable efficiency, regulations all go hand in hand, but it's a key economic lever. Next steps include pushing carbon pricing to meaningful levels, plugging the coverage gap, and aligning policies so that carbon pricing really curbs emissions at scale. Over the last decade, carbon pricing has come a long way, from a handful of schemes covering 7 to 12% of emissions in 2012 to 2015 to dozens of policy covering 28% emissions. Governments have pulled over $100 billion from carbon taxes and ETS auctions. Key milestones like China's ETS, Europe's carbon border tax, and India's new trading scheme shows momentum. But remember, the majority of emissions still pay almost zero for carbon. To really drive climate impact, we need far higher prices and much more broader coverage. What do you think? Should carbon pricing be increased or adjusted in your country? Let me know in comments below. If you found the video helpful, please give this video a like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future explainers. Thank you.